Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. For today's video I figured I'd dip back into writing advice, and specifically advice on how to create a compelling protagonist. The protagonist is, after all, the character we spend the most time with, and if your audience doesn't want to spend any time in their company, then they won't want to consume your creations. And while every protagonist is, and should be, distinct from one another, good protagonists all share a few traits in common, traits that make your audience want to hear their story and know what happens to them. So let's begin. Number 1. Motivation. This one is by far the most important trait. It's so important, in fact, that I've made several previous videos about motivation. But to give you the short version, a protagonist should always be engaged with the story you're telling, even if that engagement is a desire to make the story stop. A protagonist who shrugs and goes along with everything with no commentary and no opinion is not a protagonist at all. They are at best a point of view character whose job it is to watch as the real protagonist interacts with the story. That's why it's best to avoid the sort of broody lone wolf character you see in a lot of stories told by younger authors. Childhood involves a lot of rough years, and kids tend to take everything way too seriously since it's their first time dealing with emotional issues. And so a lot of kids, and teens in particular, tend to admire the person who acts aloof, who acts like they don't care about anything and thus cannot be hurt by anything. But the secret is that they do care. They're just better at hiding how much they care. So if you want a broody protagonist, make sure you include that secret and make sure the audience finds out about it. The earlier the better. If the protagonist is a cipher for too long, your audience will leave before they can find out the truth. Number 2. Relatable flaws. Another common mistake made by new authors is the Mary Sue protagonist. I should mention that there are a few competing definitions for what a Mary Sue is, so let me explain what I mean. In this context, what I mean is a character who is perfect, who has no flaws to speak of, and if they do have a flaw, it's either something small that doesn't get in their way, or something that's completely minimized by the story and the other characters. In other words, it's a flaw that exists for the sole purpose of letting the author point to it and say, "See? They aren't completely perfect." And again, it's understandable why so many authors fall into this trap. Everyone has this idealized vision of themselves, or else an idealized partner who would be the perfect person to fall in love with. Some folks even have an idealized vision of society, which in some stories also gets the Mary Sue treatment. Thus, when a person gets the urge to create a story, they often think of their ideals and give them a starring role. And why not, they think? If I like spending time imagining this ideal, then surely other people will also want to spend time with them. Here's the problem. A flawless character is not a character. They are perfect. And because they are perfect, they cannot change. Because if something perfect changes, it's no longer perfect. So that means a Mary Sue protagonist cannot have a character arc. On top of that, a person who is perfect is unrelatable, because no human is or can ever be flawless, especially since a lot of flaws are a matter of opinion, or else could become assets in a different set of circumstances. On the other hand, you should also make sure that your protagonist's flaws are relatable. For instance, if your protagonist is a werewolf who kills someone during every full moon, that in itself is not a relatable flaw. However, if the protagonist suffers from a periodical compulsion, one they know they shouldn't indulge in, but which makes them feel pleasure and guilt when they do so, that's something your audience understands. That's something real-life humans have had to deal with. So, if you describe the curse of lycanthropy as if it were an addiction or a compulsive disorder, then it becomes a relatable flaw. Number 3. Redeeming qualities. This is a trap that more experienced writers will sometimes fall into. Sometimes they'll be so worried about creating a Mary Sue that they'll load up the protagonist with flaws and forget to give them some positive aspects. Sometimes they'll plan out a terrible fate for the protagonist, and so they'll make the person irredeemable so the audience won't be sorry when bad things happen. And sometimes the author will plan a redemption arc for the protagonist, and so to make the change as dramatic as possible, they'll start the protagonist as low as possible. However, even if you have a great story idea you can only tell about a bad person, or possibly a villain protagonist, you should still give them at least one positive trait. Your audience can forgive a lot of bad behavior from a protagonist, but they still need a reason to forgive. Something positive that lets them say, well, at least they aren't all bad. Maybe the protagonist is a ruthless gangster who kills as easily as he breathes, but at least he's honest and he loves his mother. Maybe the protagonist is a Wall Street serial killer living in a consumerist nightmare, but at least he has good taste in music. You don't need to balance out the scales between vices and virtues, but your audience needs something to like if you want them to stick around. Number 4, a distinctive appearance. Let me start by saying this and the following trait are much less important compared to the first 3. An ideal protagonist should check off all 5 boxes, but if for some reason you need to focus your efforts, then you should focus on motivations, virtues, and flaws. With all that being said, there are a lot of different ways you can make a protagonist visually distinct. It could be something intrinsic, like a scar, a prominent tattoo, an unusual hair or eye color, or an unusual height. It could be something about their clothing, like a uniform no one else wears, an old coat they always wear, or a peculiar fashion sense that no one in the story shares. Or it could be a fantastical element, like artificial skin, dragon wings, animal legs, or claws. These features can be subtle, or they can be incredibly obvious. Either way, the point of them is to allow your audience to identify your protagonist instantly, even in a crowded room. Of course, the importance of visual recognition is greater in a visual medium than it is in a short story or novel. However, even a non-visual medium has character descriptions, and when you describe the unique features of your protagonist, you will make it that much easier for your audience to imagine them. Number 5, a memorable personality. Aside from important things like motivations and character flaws, a protagonist can also have quirks or unusual habits, things that make them stand out even from other characters who share the same goals and flaws. Lieutenant Columbo is forgetful and often returns to the suspect to ask for one more thing. Captain America from the Marvel movies missed the last 70 years of pop culture and doesn't get most references. John Wick is always polite and professional, and there are only a few moments when he lets that mask slip. However, you should also bear in mind that it's easy to let a character's quirks overpower their personality. If that happens, then even a character with a good motivation and a good heart can become so annoying that the audience wants nothing to do with them. A good test to see whether you're going too far is to ask yourself, can this character turn it off? If the quirk is humorous, can the character turn it off when things get serious? If the quirk is dramatic, can the character turn it off when the situation is lighthearted? Also, while a supporting character can afford to be very quirky, a protagonist has less room for quirks because we spend more time with them. If you have a good story but you don't have a good protagonist, then no one will know what your story was about because they won't have stuck around long enough to find out. On the other hand, if you have a good protagonist but the story is terrible, then even after your audience has forgotten the story, they'll still remember the protagonist. So while you should always strive to create the best stories you can, you should always remember to invest extra effort into making a good protagonist. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into weaving worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.